Okay, we will start like in 1 minute, 1 p.m. again on Friday. Like, if you're listening to our live streaming, like feel free to send a chat via the live chat, and we are happy to respond to any questions through chat as well. So, hello everyone. My name is CJ. I'm the co-founder and CEO of StreamNative. StreamNative is enterprise software startup that providing a cloud-native messaging and streaming platform powered by Pulsar. And I'm also the PMC member of Pulsar and the PMC chair of BookKeeper. I've been doing hands-on sessions, live talk and presentations about Pulsar and BookKeeper for a while, and I'm also can be found in the Slack channel. If you have any questions regarding to Pulsar, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions and give advices for any production, best practice, any other uh, uh, non-related to Pulsar questions as well. And yeah, excited. This is Friday, and thank you for listening to my live stream again on Friday, and hope it's useful and you enjoy the whole show every Friday. Okay, let's get started for today's show. We usually started from week in review, and the first thing I want to mention is we did Kafka on Pulsar webinar. It's also recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss uh, the webinar and you want to check out the webinar, feel free to go get on to the YouTube and listen to the webinar anytime. So it's available, and thank you for Pierre from OVH Cloud, and I'm excited to work. I'm very pressure and excited working with him and his team on this project. And the next thing I want to kind of share with the whole community is we actually wrote, I mean, not we, but a bunch of the people from Pulsar community actually wrote a kind of white paper called Taking a Deep Dive into Pulsar Architecture for Performance Tuning. And it's also available in our website, so you can go to the website and kind of checking out, download it. And oh, I forgot to share the HackMD Markdown through our live chat, and I'm sharing it right now. And if you are kind of watching, you can click the link. And this white paper was kind of written by Peng Hui from Zhaoping.com, and is one of the first Pulsar adopters who is adopting Pulsar for replacing their RabbitMQ as well as their Kafka cluster. So they're using it for building out a unified messaging platform. And the other author is Devin. Devin is from OVH Cloud. Sorry, not from OVH Cloud. Devin is actually from Overstock, and he's also one of the co-organizer of Utah Data Engineering Meetup. And Overstock is also one of the Pulsar user, and they wrote this white paper about sharing their experience on how to tune performance on Pulsar. So it's a very a kind of technical and very deep kind of white paper, and going into the from basic concept to client and then to the storage layer, and to talk more about like how and what people should kind of use and tune this the whole system, not just from the storage, but as well as the broker and also the client side. So hope you can check it out in like learn the whole architecture, and if you find this is helpful, and you can reach out to Peng Hui or Devon and said thank you. Yeah. Uh, Sorry, I just need to double check if my mic is okay. It seems my mic has some problem. Let me double check. I'm sorry about that. Let me double check. Oh, I think I'm fine. Uh, okay, so let's get back to the topic of today. I'm going to kind of take a deep dive into how to take a deep dive into looking into the uh, authentication and authorization within Pulsar. Pulsar is a kind of a multi-tenant system, and it also provides a lot of great features like TLS encryption, and also it provide all the like the authentication and authorization to make sure you are able to kind of ground access controls for to individual tenants and namespace, so you don't want to have all the people would have all access to your topics, and be able to managing like damage your cluster. So if you go to Pulsar website, you should be able to find we're already providing an very comprehensive guide uh, documentation about authentication and authorization. And Pulsar is actually providing a bunch of the authentication plugin and authorization plugin. And I want to just kind of deep dive into these sections to help people understanding how authentication and authorization work, and how to configure and enable authentication and authorization in your production environment. So the first thing you need to understanding is a role. A role you can think about is a way how the parcel system can identify who are you, and the way how parser use the mechanism parser used to identify who are you is authentication. So you use the authentication to identify who are you from a connection, and once you get the connection sorry, once parser identify who are you from the connection, and it will use a role token as your identifier, And once Pulsar identify the low token or identify who you are, then it would pass the low token into an authorization provider, and authorization provider would identify like what kind of role you are. Are you a super user? Are you a tenant admin? Are you just having a normal user permissions, like you are able to produce messages, you are able to consume messages and running functions. But uh, so that is kind of the basic idea. And the role here is a bit different from tenant. Tenant is more of a concept how you organizing your topic or your namespace in a hierarchical way. And a role, you can kind of tie a user as a role into the tenant and grant the permission for accessing the resources, accessing the system through authorization process. So that is kind of the basic idea of authentication and authorization. And so Pulsar already provide kind of many authentication plugin. First thing, you can use TOS, mutual TOS for authentication, and you can use JSON Web Token for authentication as well. And if you already having an authentication authorization system like AuthZ, you can also set up AuthZ to for authentication. Sometimes in a large organization, you might already have a Kerberos setup. You can also integrating with Kerberos for authentication. So any of the authentication plugin just take the connection and convert the connection back into a row token. And the row token would be use identifier and pass into the authorization. And the authorization plugin would verify the row token and to check if you have a permission to access a given entity within Pulsar, like for things like if you are a super user, if you are a tenant, or if you have a permission to produce or consume messages. So I mean, Pulsar already provide a lot of like comprehensive guideline how to set this authentication system up. And from my perspective, I in my show I just want to show from a more practical way how you can configure the whole system to be protected by authentication and authorization. And very similarly is because Pulsar is a multi-component system, and you want to making sure you are able to configure a system that is protected by an authentication and also authorization. So just as usual, like when you set up a cluster, like you want to enable TOS, you need to put up a kind of a diagram. You need to know how the components is talking to each other. So that is kind of the way how you want to configure authentication and authorization as well. Uh, so I bring up this diagram again, as usual. So you can see you have client, and the client might talking to a load balancer through a load balancer to Proxy, and Proxy would be configured to connecting to function worker, broker, and your broker would talk to each other for some of the requests, and the broker would also talk to the storage node, and either broker, a Proxy broker, and BookKeeper would talk to a ZooKeeper cluster. And at your right side, you will set up some monitoring components to monitoring your system for things like Prometheus, Grafana alerts, and you are having a person managing to managing the system. And you might be able to, you might also running Pulsar functions or Pulsar connectors or Presto to query and process the event in the Pulsar system. So you would also need to know what exactly the system need to be configured in order to having those components to be gated by kind of access control. So you don't want kind of non-authorized user to access the resources that is that the person is not authorized for. So that is kind of the idea. I want to walk you through the whole the kind of the system. So first thing I want to say here is from a minimum perspective is in a component, you need to know like how a client talking to a server-side component. So in order to know that is you need to configure authentication and authorization on the server side first. You need to enable the server side component to able to be protected by an authentication and authorization mechanism. And if you enable authentication and authorization on your server side, then you need to configure your client to using the same authentication mechanism you enable on the server side. So that is kind of the fundamental thinking. And that's just started from kind of the server side first. Is you need to enable authentication and authorization on your server side component. So I'm going to hide some of these components first. For example, I want to hide function worker first. Function worker, okay. And I need to hide some of these Presto functions and Presto circle, and I want to hide these. So okay. So kind of this is kind of minimum set of the cluster you want to enable at first. And so you usually starting by configuring authentication and authorization on the broker in Proxy side. And those two settings you need to enable is, okay, here you go. I need to maybe drop this here. Okay. So there are kind of two parts. The first thing is you need to enable this authentication. So you need to set a flag to be true to enable authentication, and you need to specify a provider. The provider can be TOS provider, can be a JWP provider, or can be a Kerberos provider. So it depends on what kind of authentication mechanism you are enabling. And once you're enabling authentication, if you want to enable authorization, you can turn on this authorization by setting authorization enable to be true. And similarly, you need to specify an authorization provider. By default, Pulsar only provide one authorization provider, which is authorizing the users of the roles into like super user that basically have the permission to managing all the resources in a cluster. A tenant managing all the resources under a given tenant or the permission to produce, consume, running functions within the namespace. So that is kind of the default authorization mechanism. But I would deep dive. I would mention some of the other authorization efforts that is being discussing and doing in the community late in the show. But for right now, you just need to know if you want to enable the authorization, you can use the default authorization provider that provided by Pulsar. And the other one you need to know is you need to classify who are the super user, and those settings would be used by the authorization provider to verify if if a user is a super user. So that is kind of the first setting you need to set on the server side. And let me, as usual, let me just go through kind of the actual settings to know how it looks like in the servers, in the Pulsar config. So let's go to Pulsar repo and let's take a look at the broker first. So in the broker, you can just search authentication, and there's a section you see it says authentication. And authentication, this is the flag that is control a broker to enable authentication. That is the provider that you use to do the authentication. And there's the authentication refresh check second. I will coming back a bit later to talk about this because it's used for some of the authentication mechanism to refresh the token. So this is authentication, and Pulsar is actually provide different type of the authentication provider like TOS and JWT and Kerberos. I think these are the three most common settings, and so you can set authentication provider here. But for individual authentication provider, you need to go to the detail settings. Like for example, like TOS, you need to go to the TL settings, like just like you need to set up the TLS key file and certificate file. And for JWT, you need to go to the settings that's starting from the token secret key or public key. It depends on you are using symmetric token generation or asymmetric token generation. And for some of the Kerberos, you can go to SASO authentication provider, and I think Pulsar already provide a very kind of comprehensive guideline how to setting those individual authentication provider that I'm not going to go through each of them. So that is the authentication. So once you have authentication up running, you basically are able to identify each connection as a role token. And once you identify the role, then if you want to grant access permission to individual role to different type of resources, you need to enable authorization. And so this is the setting you need to use for enable authorization. And this is the flag. You can set it to true, so it will do the authorization. And similarly, you need to you can by default it provide a default authorization provider. If you want to customize your authorization provider to integrating with your system like LDAP, then you can customize the authorization provider. And that the next is you need to make sure you set like who is your super user, and that that super user would be used for be able to do all the administration operations and be able to publish and consume from all topics. So that is the enable authentication and authorization on a broker. And similarly, if you having Proxy running like in front of broker to taking the traffic from client, you do the same thing. You need to enable authentication in the Proxy side, and you need to specify the authentication provider. And the similar thing, you need to do the authorization. I'll coming back a bit about the because Proxy is sitting in front of broker, so you need to address one thing is whether I need to forward the authorized user credential to broker to re-authorize it again. But I will talk a bit about when I'm talking about the connection between Proxy and broker. So right now, it's just like the server side setting. You can set the authentication in authorization. So once you have the setting up in the server side, you're able to configure your client side. Configuring client side it's pretty simple. So you just go to the client conf, and as you can see here, is you just need to specify what kind of authentication plugin you want to use. And Pulsar already built in a lot of authentication. You just like specify the one you are using. But if you are customizing your own authentication, you need to making sure this authentication plugin is included in your class path, so you are able to load this class. The second thing is the what we call authenticate yeah, authentication parameters. Authentication parameters is it varies between individual authentication provider. Like for example, in TLS authentication, you need to specify the TLS cert file and TLS key file. And if it's token authentication, let me just show you. If it's token authentication, you need to specify a different authentication parameters, which is called the this is Proxy broker. Yeah, sorry, in the tools. So you need to specify the token. If you are using file, you just need to specify the token file. Just putting the token file starting from file. So the authentication parameter, it varies between like authentication plugin providers. So this is a client. It's pretty simple. The most challenging part is actually coming into the system itself. Because sometimes you need to really if you having if you just have broker, then that it's fine. But if you having a broker and you're setting proxy, you are also setting up a function worker, you're also running functions, so you need to really know how kind of this component interacting with each other, and how this component forwarding the authentication credentials for a given role. So the next thing we want to take a look at here is the connection between Proxy and broker. So as you can see here, is Proxy is actually a client of broker. So when you want to set up the kind of because broker also enable authentication, and Proxy also do the kind of the similar thing. You need to know like how exactly you want to set up the authentication and authorization to make sure I don't have any security concern, or there's any kind of uh, kind of security I'll say authentication of any way for people to get around or bypassing broker to access our resources. So that is the most tricky part you need to figure out. And I can help on this is, let's take a look at this. Sorry, I need to remove this. Okay. So the first thing is whether you need to do the authentication authorization between proxy and broker. That is the first decision you want to kind of you want to make. If you make the decision, so say I want to enable proxy the authentication between proxy and broker, then you need to configure whether I need to reauthorize the credentials on the broker or not. So there's a couple things here is because proxy is already kind of sitting in front of broker, so that all your client is coming from proxy, and proxy is able to do the authentication and authorization for broker. So sometimes you don't you say, okay, proxy already do the authentication authorization, I don't need to authentication and authorize the user again. So then you don't need to configure the authentication and authorization between proxy and broker. But the risk here is proxy would taking would be the gateway to making sure all the client having the permissions to do the operations. Once the proxy kind of done the authentication and authorization, all the connections from proxy to broker will become an actual kind of a super user to do the operations. But that would raise some of the kind of the security concerns. So people also want to do the authentication between in proxy and broker. So I will show like how to do for these two different settings. So if you go to the so first thing, if you don't, let's say if you don't want this, like basically I only want to do authentication and authorization on proxy, the first thing you need to do is you can only do ZooKeeper for broker discovery. So you have to set ZooKeeper here, because you need to set both ZooKeeper and configuration store here. Why? Because in order to do for proxy to do authentication and authorization, you need to be able to access all the namespace policy, because for things like who is the tenant admin, whether you have a permission to produce to a topic within a namespace, if you have permission to run function of namespace, are all storing as part of the namespace policy and also tenant configuration. Those information are stored in the configuration store. So you have to configure these two settings in order to making sure proxy is able to authorize the permission. So that is the only thing you need to do. But if you say I want to making sure my connection from proxy to broker is also authenticated and also authorized, then you don't have to use ZooKeeper and configuration store for the broker discovery. You can just configure broker service URL and be able to discover brokers. But you have to set the client authentication, which is called broker client authentication and broker client authentication parameter. So that is kind of helping authenticate the proxy and the connection between proxy and broker. But as you can see here, the authentication is authenticate that the connection is coming from proxy, and you are a connection from proxy, but this is not a user role token from the client. This is the role token, or this is the connection from proxy. You cannot use that for authorization. Otherwise, it will create a security kind of red flag. Is you are kind of using the proxy token to authorize the permission. So in that way, you need to setting another setting is forward the authorization credentials to the broker. So basically, if you have client connecting to Proxy, and Proxy will do the authentication, and once it done the authentication, it will forward the authentication the credential of the low token from the Proxy to the broker, and the authentication parameter you set in the Proxy is just used for broker to authenticate that the Proxy has a permission to connecting to the broker, but the real client token is actually forward by Proxy to the broker through this authenticate connection. So that is the way you should kind of set and making sure the actual client also like the client credentials is forward to the broker, and the broker do the actual authorization in making sure the client has permission to access the resources. So that is kind of the tricky part that when you set up authentication and authorization for the Proxy. So once you have this figured out, then the remaining things would be much easier. So the next thing is you need to, since sometimes the for some of the operations, the broker is also talking to the other broker. So if you enable authentication on the broker side, you also need to configure the authentication for inter-broker communication. So as you can see here, it's actually the setting would be very similar as how you configure a client talking to a broker. So you need to give a credential for a broker to talking to the other broker, and then once you kind of get the credential or authentication parameters, then you can setting up this setting by setting this broker client authenticate plugin and broker client authentication parameters. So that is the setting here you can find. So this is the two settings you need to set is the broker client authentication plugin and the broker client authentication parameter that is used for the inter-broker communication. One thing you might notice here is in the last show we kind of talking about TLS encryption. We also talking about broker TLS enable. It's very interesting. I would say it's very easy for you to figure out that if the settings starting from with a broker client, those settings are the client related settings for a broker to configure the communication between from one broker to the other broker. So that is a way for you to kind of identify or learning how to configure settings from for a given broker. So this is the way for you configure the kind of communication between broker and broker. So which that means that is you need given a kind of a credential when you're setting up a kind of a authentication plugin, and as well as some authorization credentials as well. So once you have the broker setting up, I'm going to talk a bit about the authentication between kind of broker and bookie, and also broker and BookKeeper. But I'm not going to dive deeply those two settings. Right now, Pulsar provide a lot of comprehensive kind of authentication mechanism from TOS to JWT to Kerberos. But on the Bookie side, in Zookeeper side, most of the common authentication mechanism these two systems provide mutual TLS. Unfortunately, it doesn't provide any JWT token or any other mechanism at this moment. So basically, you have for configuring the connection between broker and bookie, it becomes very easy. So you just need to set a set. So you just need to enable one thing on the bookie side is enable TOS authentication and setting this setting to be true, because if you already set up TOS encryption for your connection between broker and bookie, you should be already setting up some TOS settings on bookie side. It should be very straightforward to just enable the TOS authentication there to make a mutual authentication work. So this is the setting you need to add. It's very simple. There's no other kind of settings you need to care about. And on the broker side, it's also very simple. You just need to set up these settings called BookKeeper client authentication plugin and BookKeeper client authentication parameters, parameter name, and also parameters. So if you go to the broker, let's just search broker client. You're able to see there's a BookKeeper client authentication plugin and BookKeeper authentication parameter name and authentication parameters. Those authentication plugin, it basically just the TOS plugin, and authentication parameters are just the TOS authentication parameters as well. So it's similar. I want to highlight here is if you see the naming convention we used in the broker inside is for the communication from broker to external systems, like we usually starting from like for with X client and the setting name. The X can be broker and or bookkeeper. That means if you are setting the connection between broker to broker, all the setting will start from broker client. If you are setting configure settings from broker to bookkeeper, it was starting from bookkeeper client. And but unfortunately, we don't have. I don't think we have a convention called bookkeeper client at this moment. And but that is kind of the convention we used for defining the settings within a broker, and that is the bookie broker to bookie kind of authentication and authorization. And I want to mention a bit on the Zookeeper side. Is on the Zookeeper side is actually you need to go to the Zookeeper. If I go to the last show, I actually have a setting here is the SSL user guide. So for right now, all the Zookeeper authentication, it only provide mutual TOS authentication. So you have to do the similar thing on configuring the TOS settings between the Zookeeper client and the Zookeeper server. In this case is basically broker, bookie, and proxy are the client of Zookeeper, and there's not much difference as you can as how you configure TOS encryption for Zookeeper. So yeah, that is kind of the settings for the authentication part for Zookeeper. And since it has a lot of overlap with TOS encryption, I'm not going to deeply into that part. Okay. The most interesting part is coming now is function. Function. Let me see. I need to find the link. Where's the link? Okay. Okay, broker. Okay. So here's a few things. So for Proxy talking to function worker, it should be because function worker can be run on broker. So those settings are exactly the same. So I'm not going to talk about like how to configure that part, because if you setting up the authentication authorization from Proxy to broker, you should able to do the same thing for function worker, because they are using the same set of settings. The most interesting thing is coming from configuring a function worker. For function worker, how the function worker talking to brokers, and that is the setting is also be used when you are running a functions. So I'm going to bring up another component here, Pulsar functions, and as well as this. Okay. So I probably need to kind of draw this link again. So as you can see here is, first thing, function worker need to talk to broker for some of the interactions, because function worker using some of the system topics for managing for storing the metadata for functions. So it need to having the ability to produce and consume to some of the puzzle topics. The next thing here is if a user issue a function or create a function to function worker, and the function worker would actually start a function, and the function itself need to talk to the input topic and as well as the output topic. So it need to use the credential to you need, if you kind of config your broker to protect by authentication and authorization. So you need to know how the Pulsar function get the credential into the function runner, and to let the function is able to talk to the broker and to be able to produce and consume the messages. And right now what it does is actually all the settings is in the function worker. So similarly, function worker need to configure the server side part. So you need to enable authentication, authorization, and you need to specify some of the super user role if you're having a function worker running as a separate pod. So it's very similar as how you configure the proxy and a broker. So I'm not going to deep dive into that part. But I just want to point you some of the settings so you can see authentication. So you can see here is you are able to control if you want to enable authentication, and if you want to control whether you want to enable authorization. Similarly, enable the authentication provider and as well as authorization provider. And once you have that, this is providing any connection coming from client to function worker, or any client coming from proxy to the function worker. But you still need to configure the function worker to talk to a broker, because Pulsar function is function workers actually use some sort of system topic to kind of managing the metadata. So I can just give you some of the idea here is, if you just do a list of tenants, then you should be able to see there's some of the no. So if you see this is system, my bad. So if you just go here, as you can see here is there's a namespace called post public functions. Interesting. Oh, I see. I think there's some I need to take a look at this Pulsar admin, but I want to show here is for some of these kind of tenants, you actually can see these Pulsar functions having some of the meta using some of the topics for storing their metadata and as well as the assignment. So for these settings, you need to making sure your function worker is able to talk to a broker. And so with that being said, you need to making sure your function worker is able to be authenticated as a client, as a valid client to be able to talk to broker. So that is the setting you need to set in the function worker. There's a client authentication plugin and a client authentication parameter. That's how the client is talking to the broker. So that is the first part you need to kind of config. The next thing is once you have this setting up, means the function worker is actually can run along with the brokers, but the function worker when you receive a create function request, the function worker is actually creating a functions. When it run functions, like it need to get the client authentication information and get that authentication information into functions, especially if you're running the Pulsar function as a separate using Kubernetes runtime. The function will be running a support. So how does the function worker pass the authentication parameters to the Pulsar function? That would be kind of one of the question that function work need to one of the problem function worker need to resolve. So by default, all the functions is actually using the client authentication plugin and client authorization parameter to access the topics in the topics in the to produce and consume from the topics. So basically, if you are running functions in process mode or the thread mode, you are basically using the permission that the function worker can get to access the topic and the that the proxy is that the function worker is able to access. So when you set up the function worker, you need to making sure the row token you grant for the function worker. You need to limit the permission to either just produce and consume the to a certain of the topics. Otherwise, you would create a kind of a security concern if you grant a super user permissions. If you grant a super user permissions, that means if you submit functions, then you basically the function is able to access all the functions, all the resources within your cluster. So that is the one thing when you creating when you're running function worker using thread or process mode. So that is kind of the first first thing. And the next thing is, if I run the functions as kind of Kubernetes pod, and how function worker passing the credential to the function pod. So I actually having a Kubernetes cluster up running, and I actually having already configured that to run Kubernetes run the function using Kubernetes runtime. We can take a look at how it works, but I think we're kind of running out of time. But I can having a different show to talking about this authentication or secret management in Pulsar functions. But that would become a purely separate topic. So let's take a look at how exactly that is running. So as you can see here, the function is running as a separate pod. But let's take a look at what is the command line is running. PS Java. Okay. So as you can see here, it's a Java function. So you run Java. But the most interesting setting, what we want to see here is the authentication. So you can see here, it's actually passing in the authentication plugin and authentication parameter to the function, and the authentication parameter it pass is actually a file path, and the file path here is interesting is because you don't configure this parameter, you don't configure this kind of etc auth token as part of this kind of client authentication parameter, and how this setting is got propagated into the container. So the way how it works is, when function worker execute the function, and it basically call the Kubernetes environment on creating a stateful set for a given function. When it creating a stateful set, it would also create Kubernetes secret, and it will pass the secret as part of the Kubernetes secret. And when it launch the functions, the function will mount the authentication secret into this file path, and when it mounts this authentication into this file path, then it will use that for as the authentication parameters. And this is the way how you can pass the authentication credential from function worker to a running functions in Kubernetes. And it was done in a way through a plugin, and by default it implements the plugin using Kubernetes secrets. So you don't need to worry about the secrets is leaking from a function worker to actual functions, and you are able to customize the authentication, the function secret provider to be able to using the low token to generating different type of the secrets, in passing the secrets into the running pod. So you can limit the permission for a given function to access all the resources within the Kubernetes, within a Pulsar cluster, and that is super important. Without that, you might creating a security problem, because you might giving a functions a super user permissions, and that function can use this super user permission to damage your cluster. So to recap, that is hope in this kind of in this show, you have a clear idea how this authentication and authorization are working between components. That is also super important when you want to use kind of function in connector in the system, and you also want to making sure your function in connector is running in a secured way, so you don't cause any damage. So you really need to know like how to pass these client credentials between components, and how you want to ground these credential for individual different components. Because if you don't configure this, you might be leaking a super user credential to a running function or to a running client, and that client can get this super user credential to damage to cause damage to your Pulsar cluster. So that is kind of the topic of today's show. And as usual, you can see in my show, I usually trying to having people to come up with a diagram and use that diagram to explain that kind of how different settings be set between different components, and hope that can be used a guideline for you to set up a very secured system to and a production ready cluster, so you can making sure you running the system in a protect way, and making sure you enjoy all the features providing by Pulsar, especially the multi-tenancy. And I think that is a feature that is super important to all the enterprise who is using Pulsar. So that is the show today. And in next show, I might be talking more about the Pulsar functions and getting into some of the details and how a Pulsar function worker is actually kind of managing all these credential in secrets. And we actually have developed some of the plugin in this Pulsar control, what we call security tool, that is trying to providing a simple way for you to to create some of the TOS tokens or TOS certs if you want to kind of setting up a self-signed uh, TOS protect cluster. So feel free to check out Pulsar Control, and also check out the plugin we add to Pulsar Control. And we might be adding some of the token generations as well to helping people simplify the token generation for different components, and to be able to limit the security concerns that when people using TOS to setting up the cluster. So that would be all for today's show, and thank you for your time, and thank you for listening to my show, and hope you enjoy your rest of the day, and happy Friday, happy weekend, and hope everyone stay healthy and enjoy Pulsar. And let's see you in next show. And happy Friday. Bye bye.